The room was warm, though traces of winter still lingered beneath the doors and windows. Outside, snow drifted through the dark street, while an old wooden sign creaked above the entrance. It read, Hearth. The faded letters had been worn down by years of storms and weather, yet people still found their way there whenever life became too heavy to carry alone. Inside, the café smelled of cedarwood, old books, and hot tea. Amber light rested against dark wooden walls, while a small heater hummed near the corner, pushing warmth through the quiet room. Most people kept to themselves. Some sat with steaming cups between their hands. Others spoke in tired whispers that barely rose above the sound of the heater. Nobody laughed loudly in Hearth. It was not that kind of place. Grandpa Joe sat in the same corner booth he had claimed every Tuesday for nearly 10 years. A thick gray sweater rested beneath his old brown coat. His hands were rough and weathered, marked by pale scars and swollen knuckles from decades of labor. A mug of black coffee sat between his palms while he observed the room with calm, patient eyes. Joe understood people. He recognized grief before tears appeared. He knew the silence of shame and the restless movements of fear. Over the years, he had watched countless strangers carry storms into Hearth, and he had learned how to read the weather written across their faces. Then the front door opened. Cold wind swept through the café. A young man stepped inside, looking exhausted. Snow melted across the shoulders of his dark coat. Damp strands of hair clung to his forehead, and his eyes were red from too many sleepless nights. Held tightly against his chest was a thick leather folder, bent slightly at the corners from anxious hands gripping it too hard for too long. For a moment, he hesitated near the entrance, as though considering whether to leave again. Eventually, he walked to the counter and sat down. The waitress approached. He asked only for water. Even speaking seemed difficult. When the glass arrived, the young man lowered his head and wrapped both hands around the folder again. He sat motionless, as though opening it might somehow change the course of his life. From his booth, Grandpa Joe watched him for several minutes. Then Joe slowly stood. His knees cracked as he crossed the room carrying his coffee. Without saying much, he settled onto the stool beside the young man and nudged the glass of water a little closer. For a while, neither of them spoke. At last, the young man admitted that he could not bring himself to open the folder. Inside were the results of 3 years of work, endless nights, constant sacrifice, every remaining piece of hope he had left. And buried somewhere inside him was the fear that if the work had failed, then perhaps he had failed too. The heater hummed in the silence between them. Joe listened without interruption before taking a slow sip of coffee. Then he began speaking about the years when he built wooden boats beside the old river. Most had been small fishing boats, simple, strong, reliable. But when he was younger, he once decided to build something larger, something important. He spent nearly a year crafting it from the best oak he could afford. He polished the wood until it gleamed like honey beneath sunlight. And when the boat was finally finished, the entire town gathered to watch him launch it into the river. Joe remembered believing that once the boat touched the water, his real life would finally begin. But the boat had a leak, not a small one. Before it had even crossed halfway down the river, water rushed into the hall, while people stood along the shore watching it sink into mud and dark water. Some tried not to laugh. Some did not bother trying. Afterward, Joe returned home and stayed in bed for days. The embarrassment clung to him like sickness. Every thought of the boat made him feel hollow. For a while, he even considered burning his tools and abandoning the craft completely. Failure had convinced him that perhaps he had never been meant to build anything worthwhile at all. The young man listened carefully now, no longer staring at the folder. Eventually, he asked what had changed after all of that. Joe admitted that nothing truly had. The fear remained. The embarrassment remained. Even days later, he still believed he might fail again. But eventually, he grew tired of lying still beneath the weight of disappointment. So he returned to the workshop. He picked up his saw, brought fresh wood, and started building another boat. The second one floated. Silence settled between them while snow continued drifting beyond the windows of Hearth. Joe glanced toward the folder resting beneath the young man's trembling hands. People, he explained, spent far too much time trying to build something that could never fail. But such a thing never existed. Every meaningful thing carried the possibility of sinking. Boats, dreams, careers, relationships. The risk of failure was not proof of weakness. It was simply the cost of building something real. The young man asked what happened if the results inside the folder were terrible. Joe only shrugged with a tired half-smile. Then they were terrible. Failure was not the ending people feared it to be. A failed attempt still taught something useful. Broken designs could be rebuilt stronger. But none of that could happen while someone spent their entire life protecting the first attempt from ever touching the water. The young man lowered his eyes. For the first time since entering the café, his grip around the folder loosened. Joe rose from the stool and returned to his corner booth beneath the amber light. Before leaving, he offered one final thought. The folder was not life or death. It was only wood and water. Outside, snow continued drifting through the empty streets, while the heater hummed inside Hearth. And for the first time all night, the young man reached for the clasp on the folder.